Thank you very much, Mayor Majalante. Also, thank you for keeping to the time. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, is Ms. Elizabeth Stuart. She's head of programs, or head of the program on growth, poverty, and inequality at the Overseas Development Institute in the UK. Mayor Elizabeth, your time.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Can I just check that you can hear me? Yes? Is that a yes? If you could maybe lower this a little bit more. Perfect. Thank you so much. I hope you will excuse me all protocols, other than I would explicitly like to both thank and congratulate both the government of Botswana and UNDP for choosing Leave No One Behind as a framing for this conference for the next 2 days. It's a truly inspired choice, and as was said earlier, I think it's right. This is the first international conference that's focused explicitly on this issue, which when you think that all countries in the world, including mine, the UK, has signed up to this commitment, and we've now got significantly less than 15 years to achieve it, we need a lot more conferences like this. So first of all, thank you and congratulations for that. I'm going to spend my presentation talking mostly about framing issues, because let's face it, probably most governments didn't really think too hard about what Leave No One Behind actually means and is actually going to entail in terms of achieving it when they signed up to it. It's pretty hard to disagree with the concept of leaving no one behind, but it's very hard actually to really understand what it means and to then start changing both government prioritization and donor prioritization to be able to achieve it. So that's what I'm going to focus on in my presentation. Just a word to say before I start, what makes Leave No One Behind so different? It's not, as we heard from the Honourable President earlier, it's not about poverty alleviation. I would say it's not even just about poverty elimination. It's a much broader and deeper concept than that, and we can we can understand, we derive a definition of it by a close reading of the text of the Sustainable Development Goals, of the outcome document. That's how we know that we're getting this broader definition of Leave No One Behind right. But the reason why it's so important is because, again, as we've heard in the context of Botswana, but also globally, while average consumption levels have risen rapidly since 1980, the minimum consumption floor of $1 a day, the bare minimum that people need, or which people need to survive, has barely shifted in that period. So this is quite a different approach, Leave No One Behind. So, turn the pointer the right way around. Looking then at what it does mean, there's 3 different concepts that are packed into this idea, that are sort of behind this idea of Leave No One Behind. The first one is, yes, it is about eradicating extreme poverty, and in all its forms. That's very important. Again, we've heard this morning that it's not just about income poverty, it's about poverty and access to health, poverty and access to education. So eliminating it in all its forms, but it's also about making sure that people who have been left behind catch up. And when I say left behind, that's in relative and absolute terms. So it's an inequality. There's inequality packed into this concept as well. It's poverty and inequality. Secondly, and again, we know this from reading the SDG outcome document, it's about group-based discrimination. So the first point is talking about what we call vertical inequality, income-based inequality. This is talking about horizontal inequality, the difference between groups. So it depends on your identity. Are you from a specific caste? Are you a woman? Are you an older person? And Leave No One Behind also shines a light on where you have not just a single identity that means you're likely to be marginalized and left behind, but maybe double or triple identities. Maybe you're a woman living in a rural area. Maybe you're a disabled woman living in a rural area. And that marginalization is going to be magnified and amplified by the layering on, intersectionality we call it, the layering on of those. And just to give you an example, in Ethiopia, your likelihood of finishing primary school is 77% if you come from any ethnic minority other than a Somali group and you live in an urban area. 77%, that's not a bad chance. Somali girls from rural areas have a 15% chance of completing primary education. So you see how important this idea of intersectionality is, and unpacking that. And thirdly, and this is really, I think, at the radical heart of Leave No One Behind, this is really what makes it different from the Millennium Development Goals and the imperatives in the MDGs that we all signed up to. And this is the idea of fast-tracking, of prioritizing action for left behind people. So you're not going to get to them somehow. You're not going to get to them later. It's trickle-down development isn't going to be enough here. Instead, you are going to get to those people first. Now, that will be through a combination of universal approaches and targeted approaches. I would argue it doesn't just mean targeting. We need policies to be implemented universally as well, but left behind groups will need additional targeting to help to mean that they can access those programs or those policies. But even universality isn't going to be enough for this agenda. Universality needs to be applied equitably, what the health community calls progressive universalism. This concept's quite well known by now in the health community. This means that your end goal is reaching everyone, but you start at the bottom. You start by understanding the needs and wants and priorities of the poorest and the marginalized. You build your basic health package or whatever policy intervention around their needs, and then you expand it to the rest of the population. And you want to do that quite quickly because, of course, you want to build in middle-class support for these kind of policies. Policies that only affect the poorest are soon going to become politically unpopular if you don't find the middle class is benefiting from them as well pretty soon. But you start at the poorest. Why? Because if not, you risk further entrenching, you risk increasing inequalities, because although the goal might be universal, it's often the case, and we've seen this time and time again in countries around the world, that governments will start at the top. They'll start with the elite, the urban, the easy-to-reach populations, and they won't finish the process because an election will come up. There'll be a new administration. Something will get in the way. There'll be a shock, and so the left behind have been left even further behind. And I can give you an example of where the opposite of this has happened, where health policy has been implemented progressively, and that's in Mexico. The Seguro Popular is one of the largest health insurance programs in the world, or social assistance programs in the world. And it was Julio Frenk, the then health minister, explicitly said, we're going to target the poorest districts first and build the package of what poor people need and then expand it. The other thing I'd just like to add to this definition point, we could think that we're talking about minority populations if we're thinking about for instance, specific ethnic groups or religious groups. We tend to view these groups as minority groups. But actually, again, the SDGs are very clear. The SDG outcome document is very clear that we're also talking about poor people as a group. And in several sub-Saharan African countries, the poor represent the majority, over 50% of the population. So this isn't a sort of marginal or minority agenda. This is going to be a big shift in terms of policy making. I'm going to just very quickly show you this slide on why not only action is important on Leave No One Behind, but why early action is important. And it's a little bit like paying into a pension. So the longer you leave it, the more expensive it gets. So between 2000 and 2015 in sub-Saharan Africa, ultra poverty, that's $1 a day poverty, was reducing at about 5% a year. Now, if countries are serious about meeting their Leave No One Behind target by 2030, now they need to speed that up by about 2.5 times. If they don't do anything till 2021, they're going to need to speed that up by 3 times, and so on and so on. You see, if they leave it till 2017, it's doomed, basically. I think this slide shows that quite clearly. I then want to touch on, we've talked quite extensively about why leaving no one behind is so important in terms of a moral case. I also want to make the case that there's not just an equity argument for leaving no one behind, but there is growing evidence that there are also efficiency arguments in leaving no one behind, that actually it's not going to be a trade-off between equity and efficiency, that leaving no one behind can also, there's a value for money argument, if you like. There's a return on investment argument for leaving no one behind. Now, we need to build this evidence case further, and the Overseas Development Institute, my think tank in London, we're working on this, but we have some early evidence. So across 86 countries, this is a study that's been conducted by the international NGO Save the Children. They've looked at these countries which have pursued an equitable pathway to making progress in child survival, and they've shown that countries that have done this, implemented this equitably, made faster progress, on average by 6% in terms of delivering outcomes. And a separate study, this was a UNICEF study, looked at 51 countries where you have the highest burden of child mortality, highest incidence of child mortality. And there they showed where investments went to where the highest need was, in the poorest areas, actually almost twice as many lives were saved. So there are also efficiency arguments for doing this, for taking this agenda seriously. So others who come after me are going to talk about specific policies. We've already heard from Stephen earlier on about some of the specific policies that are going to be needed. I want to mention just a couple that have been successful to show that while this is difficult, this isn't fantasy policy making. Countries have done this in some instances, and they've done it pretty quickly. But before I do that, I also want to make the point that this isn't only a social agenda. I think, again, we think about sort of poverty alleviation, poverty reduction as social programs. It's very clear for the SDG era that Leave No One Behind, we're also going to need to see progress in the economic sphere and in the environmental sphere. We need an integrated approach to this. So yes, social protection is very important, health and education, but also connectivity, for instance, broadband connectivity, access to electricity, also very important, these kind of infrastructure investments, provided they are targeted specifically, provided they're going to deliver for poor people as well as majority populations. So just an example here from Senegal. In 2010, they decided to target their rural energy access policy. They decided to target specific villages. Just 2 years later, coverage had risen from 17,000 people, individuals, to 90,000. That's a pretty significant achievement. Ethiopia, in 2005, introduced the productive safety net. By 2009, they had 7.5 million people covered. India, for instance, introduced a rural electrification program in 2005. By 2009, 70% of the villages they were targeting, and these tended to be tribal, inaccessible, hilly and rural areas, were covered. And Eritrea, a low-income country, in partnership with UNICEF, in just a couple of years, got 5,000 pastoralist children who'd previously been excluded from school because harvesting didn't work for going to school, the timing didn't work. They introduced a specific school, a specific curriculum, and 5,000 pastoralist children were going into primary education. So it is possible, but if we're really clear then on the prioritization issue, this is an affirmative action agenda that's going to entail governments and donors rethinking outcomes. If you're overweighting outcomes among a certain percentage of your population, even if it's the majority of your population, you're going to say $1 spent or a pooler spent in that community is worth more, and outcomes in that community are worth more than outcomes among people who are relatively better off. So we're going to have to rethink our risk frameworks, we're going to have to rethink our prioritization issues, and we're going to have to rethink what outcomes look like. Thank you.